Good evening, everybody, and welcome to History Author Talks. I know it's been quite a while. I've been rather busy going to conferences. I went to the Sons of the American Revolution Congress. I've been to the Atlantic Middle States District Congress meetings. So it's been a busy summer. I spend a lot of time over at Washington Crossing these days. I'm one of the senior interpreters over there, and we had a lot of summer camp kids coming into Washington Crossing. I just love doing the kids at Washington Crossing. That's so much fun. Also been busy with our musical, The Crossing. For those of you who know that I've been involved, we've had a couple of performances. This musical is in development, and I invite everybody to go to thecrossingmusical.com to see what we're doing. This is a fascinating project, and we're moving this forward this summer. We're going to be working with a number of organizations to continue the development of the musical. Another fascinating way to teach history. Tonight, we have a wonderful author who's going to join us this evening. And as always, I remind everybody that as we go through the program, be sure to ask your questions using the chat feature. And absolutely, I would hope that you all support our author by purchasing her book. You can just go to wherever you buy books or at historyauthortalks.com. You'll see right in the program notes the link to buy a copy of her book, and a portion of those proceeds go to the Sons of the American Revolution Library. So I hope that you will certainly support our author in the purchase of her book. You're going to want to, I promise you. Jacqueline Beatty earned her master's in United States history and women's gender history from Villanova University in 2012. Her bachelor's in history from Boston College in 2010. She received her PhD in early American and women's and gender history from the Department of History and Arts and Science and Art History at George Mason University in December 2016. She now teaches at York. She's a professor at York, and she's going to be talking to us this evening about her book, Independence: Women and the Patriarchal State in Revolutionary America. See if I can hold that up there. So I hope that you will all join me in welcoming Jacqueline to our program this evening. Good evening, Jacqueline.
Hi, how are you?
I'm just terrific, and I'm so pleased that you're going to spend a little time with us this evening. And I know that you are freshly back from New Zealand and Australia. Wonderful trip, and school has started, so we're back in the swing of things. So
That's right. Yeah.
we're going to start off with a chat about your terrific book. First of all, tell us about your academic journey. When did this subject that we're going to discuss this evening begin to flourish, and what sorts of undergraduate and graduate courses did you take? I realize we're not looking so far back, but isn't this field of gender history rather recent, or am I just an old fuddy-duddy that hasn't been on a college campus for a while?
Yeah, relative to history and historiography, it is pretty young. I think in terms of this field, especially early American women, women in the Revolution, the two kind of now canonical works were done by Mary Beth Norton and Linda Kerber, published in 1980. So they're now a little over 40, am I doing my math right? 40 years old, 43 years old, I guess. But they're still cited in the field quite a bit. They're still really important. And they were very important for me. Your question was about my kind of academic journey. When I decided to study history at Boston College as an undergraduate, I took a course as a sophomore on women in the American Revolution, and it was a research and writing course specifically. So we did kind of primary research in that field. And the first two books I read were Kerber's and Norton's, and they really stuck with me. And, I took a lot of different courses at BC, but I kind of never looked back from that topic, and had always been interested in that field, and continued on with that in my master's and my PhD program. I had done a lot of research on women in Philadelphia and Boston, kind of hailing from Montgomery County originally and going to college up in Boston. I was always very interested in how these two cities, and still to this day, people from these two cities kind of claim the legacy of the revolution, right? I had grown up going to field trips at Independence Hall and visiting the Liberty Bell and things like that. And then, going to college up in Boston, where they have a very different claim on the revolution. I think a lot more kind of public protest, things like the Boston Tea Party, and visiting the old State House. So it was always very interesting to me how the revolution could be kind of interpreted differently, even for us to this day, how we kind of grapple with the legacy of the revolution, but also how people made meaning from the revolution during their time. And I've just always been interested in women's history, so I kind of melded the two interests together in my studies.
So it's interesting. You started reading a lot, doing some of the research in Boston and in Philadelphia. These were obviously two of colonial America's largest cities at the time. And a lot of your research for this book deals with women in urban areas. Also in Charleston, you have a lot of stories from South Carolina as well. To what extent were you able to do research and find stories of women who were not in the urban areas, out in the hinterlands, as it were?
Yeah. So I specifically chose to focus on women in urban areas because I wanted to get a kind of more diverse experience, understanding of a diverse group of women's experiences. Arguably, right, cities are not necessarily representative of the colonial and revolutionary era experience. Something like 10% of people in the period lived in cities, where most folks lived in more kind of rural areas, right?
Right.
But what the cities offered me was this kind of hub of kind of trade and communication, and a center of political activism in a way that the rural areas did, but to much less extent. But also, I really wanted to kind of get an understanding of how poor working class women were experiencing these same challenges as their elite or even middle class counterparts. And in terms of being able to identify women kind of more easily and efficiently in the source base, the poorhouses and almshouses were really located in these urban areas. And a lot of them, especially in Philadelphia and Charleston, kept very diligent records of admissions and applications for admission. So I was able to kind of hear women's voices indirectly through those sources, looking specifically at urban areas.
So before we get into the bulk of your narrative, I was absolutely intrigued by your notes on your sources. Tell us about that research journey for your book, Independence. It's I mean, of course, I'm a military historian. I spend a lot of time studying the battles, and we read a lot of correspondence. You spent a lot of time looking at court records and where did you find all this stuff?
Yeah, a little bit by accident. It was not kind of my original intention. When I was kind of doing research, when this was a dissertation project, I read an article by Woody Holton about Abigail Adams, kind of looking into securities and bonds. And what I found really interesting about that work is that she's kind of jumping into a much more gendered masculine enterprise in finance, right, and investments. But she was using the language of kind of womanhood, her wifely and motherly duties, to kind of justify what she was doing, right? Where some folks might have not thought what she was doing was appropriate for her being a woman. So I was really interested in that dynamic, and I was going to look into records like that. And I I took my first research trip down to Columbia, South Carolina. All of these legal records are really kept in state archives in state capitals. So here in Pennsylvania and Harrisburg and up in Boston. And when I got to South Carolina, I was kind of speaking with the archivist there and telling them about my interests and the research questions I was approaching. And they suggested I use their kind of online database for identifying source material on the vast collections they have of microfilm reels. And I came across this database of petitions, which were these written requests that individuals would write to, in this case, their state legislatures, but they also wrote to local officials and to national officials as well. But basically different kinds of requests for a lot of money, relief, assistance, in the case, as I'm sure we'll get to, of husbands who were banished, right, of having their husbands repatriated, any kind of struggles that they were going through, they were looking for the state to intervene. And just because, I mean, it was lucky for me that I happened to go to South Carolina first, because frankly, the way that their archive was organized and the fact that this was easily accessible in a digitized index meant that I could keep a little Excel sheet of where I would find these sources and then go over to the microfilm reels, put them in the machine, take my photos and go. And I started reading them, and they're really fascinating sources. They can seem a little repetitive if you only read a couple of them, but when you read thousands of them, as I have done, you can really note the distinctions. And what I find especially compelling about them is that we are hearing from women who often, most of the time, are not leaving any other kind of record for us to find in their own voice. So they may be illiterate, they may not be writing these sources themselves, they may be transcribed by a clerk or kind of described orally to a clerk. But the distinctions among the sources, you can really hear the voices and empathize with the struggles that these women were going through when they were just looking for some kind of measure of assistance from the state to survive.
Well, it's amazing. You mentioned Abigail Adams. I mean, she quite the entrepreneurial spirit. And of course, you know, famous for the line "Remember the ladies" when John Adams was in Congress and she was trying to get him to be sure that this was really equality for all. That didn't really happen for a while. But throughout the book, we're not really talking about the Abigail Adamses of the Revolution or the Martha Washingtons. These were women who, I mean, these are the real housewives of colonial America, as far is what you're presenting to us here. So let's talk about this gender history a bit. Bring us into the 18th century. Can you give us a brief synopsis of the coverture laws of the 17th and 18th century, and at what point did they evolve at the beginning of the Revolutionary era? Tell us about femme sole and femme covert.
Right. So coverture is an idea kind of put forward by William Blackstone, who was an English legal theorist. And his works, recent scholars have uncovered that his works really were only published in British North America in the 1760s. But what we can kind of see is that coverture is kind of reflection of the culture as well. But essentially, this idea of coverture is that spouses were kind of one unit under the law, and the husband, the man, was the head of this household, of this partnership. And a woman who was married was referred to as femme covert, or a covered woman. A woman who is single, unmarried, was known as femme sole. So in the English common law custom, as Blackstone interpreted, women did not have the same kind of individual rights as the husband did as soon as they married. So to give you a few examples, married women would lose the right to sign contracts in their own name, and importantly, to own property in their own name. So if women, let's say there was a young woman who stood to inherit her father's property upon his death, right? Or maybe she had already done so when she married her spouse, that property would legally belong to him under this common law interpretation of coverture, right? So Blackstone would make the argument in his commentaries that this position actually afforded women privilege, I believe is the word that he uses, because they are legally protected, right? Covered and protected, kind of in the same vein that husbands owed their wives certain things, basically in exchange for their legal submission. And that included that kind of providing for them financially, since they didn't have that independent legal identity, and at least ostensibly kind of emotional care as well in the marriage, right? And this kind of legal standard is really important and will be reflected in a lot of the divorce petitions that women submit during this period and after, which I can talk about in a bit as well.
We'll certainly talk about that, but just to get into to understand a little bit more about how this all came about. I mean, these are medieval norms, really, that were established in the Anglo-Saxon era and became English common law. What was the geographical extent of coverture laws? I mean, what was going on in Germany, France, and Spain?
Oh, goodness. I don't know much about German and French legal history period, let alone in the 18th century specifically. But in terms of the British Empire, I'm fairly certain, I forget where I read this, but that Scotland did not operate under the same systems of coverture. And I think I'm a little iffy on Wales, but England certainly. And then the fact that British North America, the original 13 colonies were part of this larger English colonization project, meant that those laws and those customs were mostly reflected in colonial laws, and even after the revolution in state laws. It won't be until at least the mid to late 19th century where we start to see a number of what were called married women's property acts that start to revise women's legal access to property. And, I tell this to my students in a lot of my women's history classes. It's not until the latter part of the 20th century where a lot of married women can have credit cards in their own name. And that's a legacy of this project of coverture as well.
I remember very early on, my mother explaining to me why silver service was so important to women, because this was one thing that women could actually own, and that's why the silver service became a big deal. And we're just talking in my lifetime here.
Mm-hmm.
Also had a fascinating conversation with Dr. Frederica Baer, who's just come out with the book on the Hessians. It's as far as I'm concerned, the ultimate book on Hessian women. And we were talking about the Baroness von Diesel and von Riesel, and she was talking about how in her diaries she was fascinated by how English women and colonial women were having to deal with these coverture laws, where she had a lot more. Now, of course, she was a wealthy, privileged woman, but she had a lot. She wrote a lot about her impressions on this. So, were these social constructs addressed at all by the philosophers of the Age of Reason? I mean, did Descartes and Kant and Locke, Smith even mention any of these inequities? I mean, I don't remember reading any of it.
Well, there's my advisor has written about how the Scottish Enlightenment theorized about women's rights in this period, that there were these mutual and reciprocal duties of man and women, but that they were that there were distinct rights that men and women had. And lots of philosophers in the Age of Enlightenment are talking about women's rights, some of them in ways that would make us uncomfortable. I always when I'm teaching the first half of the U.S. history survey, I like to assign two sources together, and that's Rousseau talking about women's education and Mary Wollstonecraft talking about women's education, because Rousseau essentially comes out and what makes all of them very upset and says that, education should be reserved to those who have the capacity for it, and men naturally have the capacity to reason, and women are the caretaking gender, et cetera, et cetera. And he's a little bit more condescending than I'm being right here. But Mary Wollstonecraft has a really great reply where not only does she just obliterate his argument, but she does so in a very thoughtful and rational manner, demonstrating that women are, in fact, very capable of reason. So I always think that's a really a great illustration of the kind of debates about women's rights and how all of these arguments to try to keep women from access to education, suffrage, these other things, really are kind of intellectually bankrupt, and women are the best evidence of that intellectual bankruptcy.
So did religion play at all in this? I mean, were the New Light Presbyterians, were the women who were the Presbyterians in any better shape than the Anglican women?
Well, I think religion is certainly not my area of expertise, but the way I like to think about it is that and I kind of make this argument in the book that we need to rethink our understanding of power and rights, and not kind of impose a 21st century view of these ideas onto people that lived in a very, very, very different world in the 18th century. Religion is one of those areas where in the 18th century, women had more agency, and that would kind of grow over time, where they had a certain amount of moral authority based on their gender, right? And that's kind of changing as well. Now that's not, full equality as we would understand it today, but every little inch kind of makes a difference. And especially in the realm of education, I think that kind of coming to the realization, especially that they were citizens who were deserving of rights, is an important first step in pushing for more rights. That is
what Hackett Fischer is now coined as presentism, where we try and attribute 21st century norms and philosophies to the 18th century. It was just a very different period of time.
Mm-hmm.
British imperialism sparked colonial demonstrations, and when the coercive acts of 1774 turned into boycotts, women became both instigators and champions of the cause, as it were. Was there an ulterior motive by these mothers of liberty?
That's kind of a hard question to answer. I think you'd really have to get in their hearts and minds, which is difficult to do, as I said, with most of these women who don't leave us records. But I think, maybe they did, and maybe that doesn't necessarily matter, because I think about it in the same way that we can think about Black soldiers in the Revolution who were using service in the military in the cause, as you say, the cause of liberty, as they saw it, as a way to demonstrate that they were worthy of claiming that liberty and those freedoms, right? Women did the same thing, right? Women participated in political resistance. And I will say both for, the Whigs, the revolutionary side, and for loyalists, right? They had very clear-cut political beliefs, right? Regardless of what the norm said they should or should not have. They participated, they had opinions, right? They wrote and read treatises about politics. They talked about it with their friends, with their partners. And in so doing, kind of demonstrated that they were capable both of reason and of certain forms of liberty, whether they were willing to push for it collectively or not. It's going to take several decades after the revolution for them to start organizing and pushing for those rights collectively. But they certainly felt that they were kind of female patriots, as they would often refer to themselves as.
So in your chapter, Sympathy in the State, you outline how women were at the mercy of their husbands' behavior, pattern, politics, military service and the courts, you conclude that they leveraged their feminine dependence and subordination to gain sympathetic support from the patriarchal state. I'm curious, did this form of empowerment translate from state to state? Were women of the North and the middle colonies or the southern colonies equally subjugated to this strategy of public support?
Yeah, I think one of the questions I had when I set out to research and write this book was whether region was going to make a difference in women's experiences, right? And I'm looking at women in Boston, women in Philadelphia, women in Charleston. And I was surprised to see quite a bit of continuity in a lot of ways. Especially in the legislative petitions that women are writing to Whig, to revolutionary legislatures in Boston, Philly, and Charleston. The kinds of language that they're using is fairly identical to one another. What's different, what's really different regionally, was the kind of legal confines that women had to work around, because there are different laws in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, and South Carolina. Just to give you an example, right? I mentioned divorce a few minutes ago. Divorce had been legal in Massachusetts pretty much from the founding of the Puritan colonies. Divorce was possible in Pennsylvania, but the law became much more liberalized in 1785 as a result of the Revolution. And then in South Carolina, divorce is not legal until the period of Reconstruction. And even then, it was kind of short-lived and wouldn't come back until the 20th century. So in that case, I always refer to it as my Goldilocks example, right? You have one extreme, another, and then Philly's always kind of in the middle geographically and legally. So you can kind of get a sense of how women were seeking independence from their spouses along this spectrum of legal difference. And South Carolina provides a kind of interesting foil to Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, because, as I said, women in South Carolina could not petition for divorce, but they did have other legal mechanisms that they could use to kind of de facto separate from their husbands. So we talked about femme covert and femme sole. There was a legal mechanism that women in Charleston could use to basically earn financial independence from their husbands while still remaining married to them. So they were kind of simultaneously femme sole and femme covert. And this status was called femme sole trader status.
Mm-hmm.
And what they had to do to gain that status was submit a deed to the legislature, importantly with their husband's consent, that basically had him assenting to the fact that, you know, this woman, his wife, was going to be operating business in her own name, and he consented to that. The language in those sources, again, really kind of mirrored the very gendered language that I would see in petitions, in divorce cases. And there's a lot of kind of gender bending going on in these sources as well, because a lot of these men had to essentially admit that they were insufficient providers and their wives were effectively better at that than they were. And in the process, kind of emasculating themselves and demonstrating that their wives were kind of usurping that role that they were less capable of filling. Right. So you can kind of see, again, consistency and continuity across these three regions. It just depends on what kind of legal mechanism was available to women at the time.
So we in chapter 4, you tell us about the matriarchal allies, which was fascinating, and I was particularly interested in the story of Margaret Brisbane and her petition in South Carolina legislature regarding the Confiscation Act. That tell us a little bit about how women helped women and how Margaret exposed how the Confiscation Act affected Tory wives.
Yeah, so this is I think my favorite chapter, because it basically demonstrates that women were creating networks of reliance on one another, especially when the state or their partners failed them. when I talk about the patriarchal state, I mean these kind of patriarchal forces of law, but also society. So the household was a kind of arm of the patriarchal state, and both the legislature, the courts, as well as partners, husbands themselves, were tasked under the system of coverture with protecting their wives, right? Providing for them financially, also providing that emotional, physical protection. But then as now we have a lot of situations where this is not the reality for a lot of women. And especially when the state failed to fulfill its duty to women, they turn to each other to often survive and manage their lives amid the chaos of war. This often was female family members, so mothers, sisters, daughters were reaching out to one another and seeking help. There's a lot of examples of women in occupied cities. So when the British would leave and the revolutionary forces would take control of the city again, there were women who were either kind of fairly neutral or married to loyalists who would look to leave the city, and they'd say, my sister is in Halifax and she said she would take care of me, right? They use language like, she will take care of me, she will provide for me, and I'm requesting to leave my home here and to go to her. I found a lot of sources of women either submitting these petitions to the legislature together. They would co-sign petitions, sign as big groups of women, or they would basically have kind of carbon copies of the language of their petitions that they send individually. One set of sources I found really interesting were these sisters-in-law who both had husbands who were banished from the state of South Carolina. And both of these women,
because they were loyalists.
Yes, right. Or and it's always a little murky, right? These guys were decidedly fairly loyalist, but sometimes it's insufficiently loyal to the revolutionary cause or whatever. So these two women, their petitions were identical in language, but there were differences in things like spelling and punctuation and capitalization, which seemed to me as if they were kind of having a conversation, writing the same content, but with kind of different, inscribing it differently, transcribing it differently. There's a whole set of widows of soldiers from the 7 Years' War, actually, whose husbands were taken captive and later killed as a result of the war. And it's over a series of years that they, the first woman explains the situation, that she's owed a pension and this is her husband's service. And the women that follow repeat that language and then refer back to one another. So it's very clear that they're talking with each other and sharing these strategies. And the best source of all is where there are two women in Boston. I believe the first woman's name is Sarah Rust, and she petitions the Suffolk County Court for a divorce, and her petition is denied. Her friend Helena Bayard also petitions the same county court for a divorce a little while later, and her petition was granted. She was given a divorce by the state. Sarah Rust comes back a little while later after that and essentially says, remember me? I petitioned for a divorce. And I just heard from my friend that she was granted a divorce, that you granted her a divorce, and her situation is not as bad as mine. So I think you should reconsider. And they did, and they granted her a divorce. So there's a lot of kind of collaboration in this way of women working together and pushing back in some ways against the state when they won't help these women out.
So divorce was far from the societal norm at the time. Explain 18th century divorce American style.
Yeah. So as I kind of said earlier, all of these colonies and states had different laws related to marriage and divorce. Massachusetts was a bit of an outlier in that it allowed for divorce during the entire colonial period and beyond, because Puritans generally viewed marriage as a civil contract, right? And if you break a civil contract, the terms of the contract have been dissolved, right? So women in Boston who are petitioning for divorce are very much when they are presenting their case to the courts, they speak in contractual terms, right? They say that their husband has not fulfilled his duties upholding the contract of marriage, right? And they list all the ways in which he had failed to uphold the contract, and then they back it up with all the ways in which they had. And all of this, it's not contractual language that would be familiar to us in the 21st century, but it's duties of husband and wife, right? So he failed to provide for me. He was abusive. He absconded, this, that, and the other thing, right? There are a number of causes for justifications for divorce, namely adultery was the kind of most commonly cited cause. And it really depended on the state. And again, in South Carolina, it was not a possibility. So they had a number of legal financial workarounds that they employed. And Pennsylvanians would see the law change in 1785 as a result of the revolution, as Linda Kerber has argued. And what I was able to see in the records was a big spike in requests for divorce in the immediate aftermath of the passage of that law. And then they kind of even out over time after that. So there was clearly a desire for that kind of legal outlet that the new law paved the way for those petitions.
And you have some terrific graphs in your book, Independence, which show how that happened through the years and in the different states. I want to remind everybody that we certainly invite you to ask any questions about what Jacqueline and I are talking about this evening, and just you can go into the chat section and you can ask any question that you would like. So in your research, tell us how the Whig wives of Tories fared compared to those whose husbands were loyal to the cause, and specifically how they broke down by class. How did women from the privileged class generally fare in their petitions as compared to those of the lower classes?
Yeah, your second question's a lot quicker and easier to answer, so I'll start there. I think it probably comes as no surprise, but the women who had access to various forms of wealth and privilege, and especially were in networks with kind of powerful people, people in the legislatures especially, found very sympathetic audiences to their petitions, right? And this is a relatively small world, especially of elites in these cities. Many of these people knew each other. So that would work in people's favor if they were on, the winning political side, right? The political side of the folks who were in power after the revolution. It didn't work as well for these kind of elite folks who were trying to reclaim property if they had identified, or their partners had identified, as loyalists. It's especially difficult, actually, for women in this kind of middle position, right, where the general social custom at the time was that women were supposed to be apolitical, which is not really the reality, right? Women have always had political opinions, and they're having these discussions with men, with each other. But women were able to use the assumption of their nonpartisanship as to their advantage, right? So we would see cases in these petitions of wives of loyalists who essentially would argue to the state that, yes, my husband did these things, but I didn't do these things. I'm just being a good wife and mother devoted to him. And a lot of these women would also use their kind of feminine subordination in that way to cover for their husbands. So they often argued that their husbands, who maybe signed a loyalty oath to the British when the British had occupied the city, that in fact they were doing that because they were looking out for their wives and children, right? They were really protecting their communities and their families. And yes, they made a mistake, but they were doing it in their kind of husbandly and fatherly roles. So that's always very interesting to see the women kind of exude the power that was necessary to bring their husbands home, by basically saying that they were powerless and their husbands were only being good husbands in that context. There were plenty of women who did assert their own political position, most of the time separate from their husbands, right? If their husbands were loyalists, they would kind of argue, well, I've always been devoted to the revolutionary cause, and please don't punish me or my children, who are these kind of helpless, vulnerable dependents in this situation, right? And they use that, I wasn't the one who was doing this, and I was in the right, so you shouldn't take advantage of poor women who who were not the instigators of this war. Is the language that I believe Margaret Brisbane uses that you referred to. She's very, very critical of the legislature, though, and that's where she ran into trouble, because she not only blamed her husband, who fled and left her with children and stepchildren to care for, but she also blamed the legislature, right? Saying that that men started this war, and that the Confiscation Act is essentially punishing vulnerable, innocent dependents like herself and her children. And she really lets it rip. She goes after them very clearly, and advocates for other women and children in that situation. And her petition was decidedly not granted. So it was very advantageous for women to basically shamelessly cater to their audience, tell them what they wanted to hear. And if they kind of stepped too far out of line in their criticism, they could be ignored or have their petition rejected.
So let's talk about the Confiscation Act in South Carolina in particular. I mean, every one of the states had a form of Confiscation Act, but it seemed that women were able to use the Confiscation Act in South Carolina, or at least in what you present in your book, in Independence, the how women used the Confiscation Act to gain satisfaction with their petitions. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think, as you said, every state had their own kind of measure here to confiscate property of loyalists or alleged loyalists, and then, sell it as they would. In South Carolina, I think I mentioned this in the book, that there is a huge spike in the number of petitions submitted by women during and in the immediate aftermath of the revolution. Whereas in Boston, women had been kind of petitioning fairly regularly, for example. So what we see there is that women were very much politicized as a result of the war, right? That the consequences of the war for women, that it was very disruptive, that they were they saw their husband's property confiscated, essentially meant that they were forced into this political realm to advocate for themselves, right? And many times in their petitions, the bulk of these petitions to the South Carolina legislature from Charleston women are in response to this Confiscation Act, right? It's this Confiscation Act that really politicizes them, but the language in their petitions very much reinforces the language of feminine helplessness and subordination, right? They will make arguments that they are vulnerable, that in some cases they need the help of their husbands, or they need the income from this lost property to support their children in his absence, right? Which makes them kind of more independent financial actors as their husbands are banished from the state. So it's really interesting that it has a really negative effect for a lot of women, but many of them also use this opportunity to assert political power through these petitions to the state.
In chapter 6, To Have and to Hold Herself, you diligently presented what little research you managed to uncover on the struggle Black women faced during the Revolutionary era. I sense you were on a treasure hunt looking for threads of consistency and logic of a white society looking to find solutions to the plight of both free and enslaved Black women. In the end, you redefined petitioning, which sowed the seeds of the abolitionist movement. Explain.
Yeah. So when I was editing the dissertation for the book, I think originally when I was researching the dissertation, I probably naively thought I was going to find Black women's petitions in the archive and in the same kind of format that white women were petitioning. And I found, I think, 3 or 4 total. So, that was, I guess, jarring to come across. And I decided that I wanted to, in revising the dissertation for a book, really purposefully seek out the experiences of Black women in relation to the state in the context of this war. So in kind of speaking with archivists and other historians, I started looking in South Carolina again at emancipation deeds, which are these legal documents that are written in the voice or from the perspective of enslavers who are saying, I, John Smith, declare that so-and-so, identify as a slave woman in the language of the time, is hereby free, right? And the language of these sources when we're talking about enslaved women who earn their freedom often included, almost always included, that she would be free and her heirs forever and ever. And that language really stuck out at me because that's not language that you would see for men because of, again, these kind of arcane legal structures, this time based in specifically the American colonies that had enslaved populations, that children born of enslaved women would follow the legal status of their mother, which is different from traditional English custom prior to this point. So that meant that any children that an enslaved woman would give birth to would also be enslaved, and then all of those generations that would follow. So the power of the document that would free an enslaved woman, basically saying not only is she free, but all generations, all children, grandchildren, etc., in this female line will also be free, right, was really significant. But of course, these documents are written in the voice of enslavers, right? We don't hear from enslaved women themselves, and you really won't in the record because they were kept from literacy on purpose. But in the same way that the petitions that I read, the legislative petitions submitted by white women, if you read enough of them, you start to see language that differentiates from the others. The emancipation deeds were that way as well, where I would start to hear kind of stories about what these women were doing, right? How diligently they were working. And, there were stories of husbands who would be working to free their wives and children, and mothers who are doing the same to free their children and then themselves. There's one story in particular that I highlight in that chapter that you mentioned, of a woman named Diana who kind of gains skills as a midwife and is able to purchase her freedom and her children's freedom with those skills. And she, at this point, the law in South Carolina required that men in the community sign off that these newly freed people are not going to become a kind of financial burden on the community, and that they're of good and upstanding character. And she got a number of men to sign off on that. So implicit in the words of these enslavers is the activism and the work that Black women were doing in advocacy of themselves, their freedom, and their children's freedom, right? You can see the amount of work that Diana had done to free herself and her children, but you just have to really, really read closely and in between the lines. And what I argue in the book is that that's a form of petitioning and activism, right? It's just not how we otherwise had traditionally defined it thus far.
Absolutely. So Joe D asked a question. If a woman inherited property while single, then marries and the property becomes her husband's, what would happen if she wants to get divorced? Would the property revert back to her since it was her to begin with?
It depends. There are sometimes, one of the weird legal quirks in South Carolina, for example, and other states use this as well, but South Carolina used it the most, were these marriage settlements where, and this is another way that women who couldn't divorce were able to gain financial independence. And this is mostly used by wealthy families who did have a lot of property that their children stood to inherit. that these marriage settlements were kind of like prenuptial agreements, right? Where there were sometimes clauses that if a husband was spendthrift or went into a bunch of debt, that like this portion of the property would be reserved for the wife regardless. And there were some places that, I mean, everywhere reserved a third of a husband's property in dower rights for a widow if the husband were to predecease their wives. And there's a really great example of a woman in Boston named Free Love Scott, which is a really excellent name. And Scott's husband had been banished or fled, I believe, Boston due to his politics. And she's one of these women that says, my politics are different from him. I'm for the cause, and I was always doing the right thing. And she petitions again and again, and basically gets a kind of de facto divorce in that, well, I guess it's more apt to say that the state kind of declared her husband de facto dead because they gave her that 1/3 dower portion that's normally reserved for widows. She got that part of her husband's property despite him still being alive and well in England. And then they used that as precedent for other women in Massachusetts in similar circumstances. So it did depend. And there were also kind of stipulations for alimony depending on what the judge decreed. I should clarify too that there are two different forms of divorce, right? The kind of full legal separation that would allow both parties to marry again and have their independent legal identities. And then kind of more of a separation where the husband would still be required to provide financially for his wife, but they would live separately. They wouldn't marry others because they were still kind of technically married. So there are different kinds of forms of divorce as well.
That's a different kind of alimony.
Yeah.
So Michael Barberi asks, in researching the common soldier, he has found it quite fascinating for women's pension applications, both in support of the living soldier and for their own application as a widow. Tell us about, I mean, I didn't see much in the book about this, but is this an area that you explored at all? Or
oh yeah, in the final chapter I talked a bit about widows who are claiming pensions from their late husbands who served in the revolution. And what was really compelling, to me, is that they discuss this pension often as a right which the state owes them, and that I think is one of the most important takeaways from these petitions, is that language of rights starts to appear in these petitions in the early 1770s, where women start to talk about things that their husbands and the state owe them as dependents as rights. Right. So these are things that the state had owed them for, generations, centuries, right, under these terms, but they're only at this point in the revolution starting to claim them as rights that they are owed. And widows do this with their pension applications and their petitions to make sure that those pensions are coming, right? Because the Continental Congress had some issues there. So the fact that women are really using this language of rights that is present throughout the revolution, that male leaders are using to, resist the British, that women are starting to say, no, we have rights as well, right? They're different kinds of rights. They're maybe not rights that we would recognize today in 2023, but they were, again, it was a kind of step in the direction towards pushing for more rights, first recognizing that they were endowed with rights and they were going to agitate for more full rights over time.
Right. So one of my authors, Jeanne O'Connor, who's with us this evening, the author of the book The Remarkable Cause, which is a novel about James Lovell, asks a question. And Jeanne, if you permit me, I'm going to reword it a little bit. There were quite a few women who, through the revolution, became quite successful in their own right, having taken over their husband's business during the course of the war. If those it was rare, but certainly there are interesting stories. I mean, Betsy Ross, for example, became a very successful seamstress in her own right throughout the war. What with women who became successful, it seems though it's in their best interest not to remarry. I mean, is
Oh,
that?
yeah. No, for sure. This is kind of very true. I always teach this example with my students, but kind of the early colonial Chesapeake, it took the early Virginians a while to realize that if they wanted to build a society, they needed women. So there were far fewer women. Women had kind of greater advantage in choosing partners in that first generation in the colonial Chesapeake. So they tended to be much younger than their husbands and far outlived them, right? And inherited quite a bit of property. And then that gave them power, whether they chose to remarry or not. And many of them actually did, but they had leverage. But yeah, I think I had a question at the last book talk I did about this is, is there really motivation for these widows who inherit a lot of property to remarry? And in some cases, no, and plenty of them didn't, right? Yeah, that they were able to support themselves, right? And, if they did remarry, there was more I would say it was less of a financial concern, obviously, or a financial question, if they were able to support themselves independently. And many of those widows would work with a lawyer to make sure that there was property and money set aside for their children and potentially for themselves, and create those marriage settlements prior to entering into another marital contract.
Sure. Well, we're winding down now here, and so now the war is over. The ravages of the war were devastating to women, many of whom spent the war not only alone, but having to do all of their womanly work of raising the family, but the work of their male counterparts who were raising the farms and business. And still, the all men are created equal was literal, and women's rights were not equal, but were instead benefits expressed in the performance of their duties as wife and mother. So everyone's going to have to buy a copy of Jacqueline Beatty's book, Independence, to hear what happens next. And I encourage you to do so, because you're going to learn a lot. This is social history at its best, Jacqueline, and I think you have done a terrific job. In the minute and a half we have left, what's on the horizon? You got something in the works?
Oh yeah, I have my list that I'm staring at over here. I have a couple pieces, but one that's more kind of historiographical, talking about the way we gender politics in history. When we talk about political history, that should be coming out in a year or so. I think I heard you say there are a couple of OAH members. I have hopefully something coming out in their April, maybe, the monthly magazine they send out about teaching women's history and the revolution. I was just asked to do a manuscript about 25 women who shaped the American Revolution. So that is potentially in the pipeline several years down the line.
Excellent.
And still trying to formulate the next other kind of monograph book project, but that's in very, very, very early stages. Took a little mental break from book writing this summer.
Well, I know that all of us history fans who are out here watching you this evening and listening to you are going to be watching closely. You have a terrific first work here, and I applaud you. Congratulations, and my best to you, and I hope we'll keep in touch.
Great.
And to everybody tonight, I thank you so much for joining us on History Author Talks, as always. I do have Ben Karp, who Jacqueline
Ben.
coming up. Ben's actually, we're going to do a triple play with Ben. We're going to talk about all of his books in one show. And Ben's a great guy. So I've forgotten the date, but you'll check on historyauthortalks.com. I want to thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. And once again, Jacqueline, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. And tell Ben I say hello when you see him.
I sure will. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.